Let's look at how the legendary Portuguese explorer Ferdinand Magellan lost his life at the Battle of Mactan in 1521 in one of the earliest colonial battles, in this case in the Philippines. Hi folks, I'm Matt Easton of Schola Gladiatoria, and today we're going to be looking at the Battle of Mactan in 1521, where the legendary Portuguese explorer and discoverer of what are now known as the Straits of Magellan, Ferdinand Magellan, lost his life in a battle against the Filipino hero Lapulapu. Now, the Battle of Mactan happened on April the 27th, 1521, where, as mentioned, Ferdinand Magellan lost his life leading a force of predominantly Spanish soldiers against some local Philippine forces under the chief Lapulapu. Now, there isn't an awful lot of source material for what happened at the battle, but the primary source which we're actually going to be reading here, because as you know on this channel we love primary sources rather than later interpretive sources. Now, the primary source for this battle comes from a writer by the name of Antonio Pigafetta, who was Italian, and he was working for Magellan, and he was actually at the battle himself. He was essentially a sort of aide or personal assistant to Magellan, and therefore he was writing notes about the entire voyage and the battle itself and the aftermath. He himself survived the battle, whereas of course Magellan didn't. There are some other sources for what happened at the battle, and we're going to look at those towards the end of this video after we've looked at the primary source of Pigafetta's personal sort of narrative of the battle itself. And hopefully, as aficionados of arms and armour, weapons like these, we're going to be looking at these in a minute, you will find some things of interest in this personal source, and I will break out some of this personal narrative, some of this primary source. I'll break into it with some of my own observations and thoughts as we go through. Before we get into that, I want to mention very briefly that the very kind sponsors for this video are, appropriately, Magellan TV. And I've got a free trial offer for you here. What is Magellan TV? Well, quite simply, it's a subscription service with thousands, I kid not, thousands of documentaries on a massive range of subjects ready for you to watch right now and try out with this free trial. Magellan TV is a subscription-based service which is completely ad-free and has loads of new 4K content going up every week. It's television worth actually watching. It's an incredibly carefully curated selection of documentary series from around the world. And viewers of this channel have this special offer to try a month's free trial. I mean, just in that month you could probably watch a whole ton of stuff with the link down below and the code Schola Gladiatoria. Right, so let's get back to the Battle of Mactan in 1521. Now, just very briefly before we get into this, I want to make some historical context before we talk about Magellan, before we talk about the battle and everything else. And that's because if you look for things to do with the Battle of Mactan, whether it's in documentaries or online, in articles, even in history books, you will find a lot of, for people who are interested in arms and armour, a lot of later period corruption in how people are represented and what they're represented with. Both in terms of the Europeans there, which are primarily Spanish, but also, as we see, Italian and Portuguese as well, and probably other nationalities mixed in with the ship's crews. But in addition to that, the local Philippine natives as well. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, the arms and armour, quite simply, if you look at reconstructive pictures of the Battle of Mactan, you will often see Magellan represented somewhat like a Spanish conquistador of really 50 years later, wearing arms and armour that doesn't really fit in 1521. So, purely to mention that the arms and armour of 1521 in many ways have more in common with what we see at the end of the 15th century, the late 1400s, really, than with things we see at the end of the 1500s, okay? And in fact, as far as swords are concerned, don't think, oh, this is the age of rapiers or something like that. Really, 1521, not really quite yet. So the Europeans would have been using swords like this side sword here, or in some cases, simple arming swords or long swords that you would have seen at the end of the 15th century. And what were the Philippine natives armed with? Well, primarily, as we'll see from the source, spears, shields and bows. They're their primary weapons. So everybody thinks Filipino weapons, I'll immediately grab, I've got a selection here for illustrative purposes, they'll think of things like this Moro Kris. But this is really although there were earlier versions of it, this is a 19th century weapon. when we're talking about Philippine warriors in the early 1500s, they've primarily got spears and shields and bows. They're the primary weapons. And yes, they had swords. We're going to see that in a second. Yes, they had swords, but we should expect certain types of campilan and types of kris, but earlier forms of. So don't expect to see them exactly the same in the 1500s as they were in the 1800s. So first up, very briefly, this isn't a biography of Magellan by any stretch, but if you don't know who Ferdinand Magellan was, he was an explorer and a soldier and a captain. He was very experienced at warfare, particularly nautical, naval warfare and navigation and things like this. He was a very successful captain as he became famous as an explorer, but what he was really trying to do was the early stages of colonialism. So the Pope had created a dividing line on the map and said to the Spanish, this bit's yours, and said to the Portuguese, this bit's yours. As you can imagine, the Protestant, English and Dutch and others had other ideas about this, and history panned out in certain ways, and that's why we get a lot of the conflict in the 1500s and into the 1600s as a result. But nevertheless, so the Spanish and the Portuguese had gone in search of new lands to essentially get things from, trade with, if we're being sort of quite charitable about the description. Or in other words, we might say exploit. In other terms, colonize. That came a little bit later on. So the Portuguese essentially, the Spanish and the Portuguese were both looking for new lands. Now, Ferdinand Magellan was Portuguese. He was a Portuguese nobleman. However, he offered his services to the King of Portugal. The King of Portugal was like, I'm not interested. I know someone who doesn't like you. And so he went, fine. He went to the King of Spain. And so he offered his services to Spain. Spain accepted. So Magellan went in search of a new route to get essentially to the Pacific Ocean. He was actually initially looking for a route through the Americas, in other words, a river, didn't find it, ended up going around the south coast, the Straits, what are now known as the Straits of Magellan. It was a very perilous journey. They started out with 5 ships. They ended up with only 3 ships, made it through the strait, and they ended up landing in the Philippines. So once the Spanish sailors and soldiers arrived in the Philippines, one of the first things they started doing was trying to make alliances. And under Magellan, of course, who was Portuguese himself, Pigafetta, who was his assistant, who was Italian. So we've got different nationalities there, but fundamentally they are operating for the Spanish crown. And initially they started making alliances with local Filipino leaders. Now, one of the things that Magellan had been involved in earlier in his career, I think around 1514, 1515, had actually been combating Islamic opponents in the Indian Ocean, essentially. So he was trying to limit the expansionist interests of certain Muslim forces, and he had an interest, and this was also an interest of the King of Spain, in converting people to Christianity, specifically Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. So one of the first things he started doing was making alliances with the local Philippine leaders, chiefs, rajas, and things like this, and tried to convert them to Christianity. And he succeeded. So Magellan was successful in creating several alliances, and some people converted to Christianity, including some influential leaders who took on Christian names and told all of their people, you're Christian now. So he was quite successful in some cases. And as a result of his influence with a certain Raja Humabon, I believe the name is pronounced, that Raja basically commanded all of the other chiefs in the area to bring tribute and resources, essentially, for the Spanish under Magellan, under Portuguese leadership. So, and most of them did it. In fact, I think all of them did it, except for a certain stubborn leader by the name of, as it's come down to us, Lapulapu. So essentially, Lapulapu became the figurehead for a sort of resistance movement against this foreign influence coming with the Spanish, both in terms of the conversion, but also in terms of giving things which belong to them, like food and probably animals and things like this, to the Spanish ships. He didn't want to do that, so he built up a resistance movement to oppose them and drive them off. And this culminated in the Battle of Mactan. So at this point, we now come to Pigafetta's own text, and we're going to analyse it. Now, Pigafetta himself was born not far from Venice, within the Venetian influence, but he ended up in Spanish employ and on Magellan's essentially voyage, essentially. And he was a writer. He left writings to us. He is an eyewitness to what happened, and he is the primary source for the Battle of Mactan. Right, he writes, on Friday, April the 26th, Zula, a chief of the island of Mactan, sent one of his sons to present 2 goats to the Captain General and to say that he would send him all that he had promised, but that he had not been able to send it to him because of the other chief, Lapulapu, who refused to obey the King of Spain. He requested the captain to send him only 1 boatload of men on the next night so that they might help him and fight against the other chief. The Captain General decided to go thither with 3 boatloads. We begged him repeatedly not to go, but he, like a good shepherd, refused to abandon his flock. At midnight, 60 men of us set out armed with corselets and helmets, together with the Christian king, the prince, some of the chief men, and 20 or 30 balangues, which I think are Moros, but there's conflicting information on that. So, just briefly, so for the arms and armour people watching this channel, they mention corselets and helmets. Now, these are, as we'll see, later important in the conflict because they're armoured. Okay, so what you have to bear in mind is that Europeans turning up in the Philippines at this time, almost all of the Filipino natives would have been completely unarmoured, and whereas the Europeans were wearing steel armour. Now, the corselets and helmets, what were these? We don't know exactly. Probably the helmets are forms of sallet, possibly early forms of something like a sort of burgonet or cabasset or something like this. We don't really know, but they're not the later morions you might think of conquistadors with yet. They haven't really developed, although earlier forms of them were starting to develop. Now, corselet is a problematic term. It could mean a cuirass, it could mean a breast and back plate with a fold and tassets, possibly, or it could potentially mean a coat of plates. We don't really know. It's not precise enough. Corselet just really means a thing that goes around the body. I have a hunch that it probably means breast and back plate with tassets, with a fold and tassets at this time. So 1521, if you imagine the sorts of breastplates and tassets that things like landsknechts are wearing around this time, possibly something like that. But it's not the later sort of Elizabethan era style or conquistador style stuff. This is an earlier period. So could be a mixture of brigandines and breastplates. We don't really know. He goes on. We reached Mactan 3 hours before dawn. The captain didn't wish to fight then, but sent a message to the natives by the Moro to the effect that the Moro people, with his assistants essentially, to the effect that if they would obey the King of Spain, recognise the Christian king as their sovereign and pay us our tribute, then he would be their friend. But if they wished otherwise, they should wait to see how our lances wounded. They replied that if we had lances, they had lances of bamboo and stakes hardened with fire. They asked us not to proceed to attack them at once, but to wait until morning, so that they might have more men. Strange. So this is a kind of, I guess, a tribal mentality to conflict, and we see this in anthropological studies that we often think about war in sort of all-out war terms, but they are literally going, can you just wait until morning because we're not quite ready yet? And this seems very strange to us, but we find that sort of dialogue very actually common in tribal societies. They said that in order to induce us to go in search of them, for they had dug certain pit holes between the houses in order that we might fall into them. So they're sort of threatening, and it's a strange kind of, it's not the normal sort of dialogue you get between European opponents, but this isn't normal European warfare. This is the beginnings of colonial warfare that we'd see centuries of after this. When morning came, 49 of us leapt into the water up to our thighs and walked through water for more than 2 crossbow flights before we could reach the shore. The boats could not approach nearer because of certain rocks in the water. Now, I probably need to explain something about that. So when he says the boats, he's talking about the 3 ships, okay, the 3 large ships, which would have been armed with cannons, presumably, and other firearms. They couldn't move closer because of coral reefs and or rocks. So essentially they had to anchor quite far out. He says 2 crossbow flights. Now, how long is a crossbow flight? It depends on the crossbow and it depends on the bolt used. But if we call it 300 meters, then about 600 meters away. So in other words, the boats, the main ships, are far enough out that they can't be of any use to anything that happens on the beach, and that's very important. They're also not particularly easy to retreat to either. That's also important. But also important and interesting is the fact that they could wade up at thigh height across the coral reef or across the rocks, let's say 600, 800 yards from the ships to the beach, which is quite an incredible distance to be able to wade at that sort of height up to the thighs. So very, very interesting. Anyway, the other 11 men remained behind to guard the boats. When we reached so they only left 11 men on the ships. It was not much at all. When we reached land, those men had formed into 3 divisions to a number of more than 1,500 people. Okay, so 1,500 people versus their like 50 or 60. When they saw us, they charged down upon us with exceedingly loud cries. 2 divisions on our flanks and the other on our front. So they did a pincer move essentially. So they would have, their 1,500 men, let's say 500, 500, 500, were divided in 3. 1 came at the front, 2 came from the sides, from the flanks. When the captain saw that, he formed us into 2 divisions, and thus we began the fight. The musketeers or arquebusiers, they would be called, the gunners anyway, the musketeers and the crossbowmen shot from a distance for about a half hour. So there was obviously a standoff. So although he says they charged down screaming, they must have stopped at a certain distance, and we'll find out that that is the case in a second. And they stood there shooting at each other for half an hour. Can you imagine standing there reloading and shooting, a mixture of crossbows and arquebuses, and the opponents, as we'll see, with their own missile weapons, just shooting at each other for half an hour. Again, this is something we find, obviously you find it later on in musket warfare, but we also find it in tribal warfare, where two warrior groups will sometimes come up within about 30 yards of each other and just shoot arrows at each other or throw spears at each other. There isn't as much hand-to-hand combat, certainly not initially, as you might assume. But uselessly so, the shooting was useless, for the shots only passed through the shields, which were made of thin wood, and the arms, presumably the arms of the people holding them. Now that seems strange to me, because surely if shots, particularly from an arquebus, but also of a crossbow, are going through a thin wood shield, are they going to hit the person behind? I don't really understand Picafetta's point there, but anyway. The captain cried to them, "Cease firing! Cease firing!" But his order was not at all heeded. When the natives saw that we were shooting our muskets to no purpose, crying out, they determined to stand firm, but they redoubled their shouts. When our muskets were discharged, the natives would never stand still, but leapt hither and thither, covering themselves with their shields which we've just been told are of thin wood and things go straight through them. They shot so many arrows at us and hurled so many bamboo spears, some of them tipped with iron, I'll come back to that, at the Captain General, besides pointed stakes hardened with fire, stones and mud, that we could scarcely defend ourselves. Seeing that, the Captain General sent some men to burn their houses in order to terrify them. So the houses are right by the beach, as we find out. So this is very interesting. So there's a standoff, they're shooting at each other. Now, the Philippine natives under Lapulapu, it seems their primary weapons are bows and spears. But we find a nice detail about we'll find out more about the arrows in a second, but we find out a nice detail about the spears there, because it explicitly says some of them tipped with iron. Ergo, not all of them were tipped with iron, and probably most of them weren't. They are literally just sharpened bamboo spears, which are going to do the job against people who aren't wearing armour. And that's really important. The armour really dictates how this fight pans out. And in fact, you might think, well, why on earth were these Spanish and Portuguese and Italian men so confident to go on shore against 1,000, 1,500 opponents when there's only 50 or 60 of them? And the answer is guns and armour. And that's because time and time again, by this point already in colonial warfare, European forces has found that if you had metal armour and you had guns and crossbows, you could outrange, outpenetrate, outshoot, and against most colonial opponents, and be completely invulnerable to most of their weapons because you're wearing metal armour, which their weapons can't bypass. Right, I think that's a good point. Just to stop for a second and talk about our great sponsors again for this channel, who are Magellan TV. So as I said, Magellan TV is offering you and all viewers of this channel, with my code Schola Gladiatoria and the link down there, a fantastic month's free trial of Magellan TV, and there is a ton of stuff on there that will interest you if you're watching this video. In fact, I've just watched Medieval Lives, Birth, Marriage and Death, which is a great documentary to give you a bit more context about medieval life. We're not only thinking about arms and armour in an abstract context, it gives them meat on the bones and gives them a little bit more historical context behind medieval warfare and things like nightly lives. Of course, as well as all the great history content on Magellan TV, you can also watch things about science and nature or art. And you can watch it on the go anywhere on your television, on your tablet or on your PC. So click that link in the description box to get 30 free days trial to watch whatever you want, but Medieval Lives is a great place to start. And all of the rest of Magellan TV's extensive collection of over 3,000 documentaries. So why not try out that free offer right today using the link below or the QR code on screen. And thanks once again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to the content. So the soldiers have set fire to the Filipino houses, and when they saw their houses burning, this is Pigafetta's own words, they were roused to greater fury. I'm not surprised, they're burning their houses. 2 of our men were killed near the houses, while we burned 20 or 30 of their houses. So many of them charged down upon us that they shot the captain through the right leg with a poisoned arrow. Now, that poisoned arrow is mentioned in other people's accounts of this, so I think that definitely happened. The exact way that Magellan died is up for debate, but I think that poisoned arrow is an element to it, definitely. And it's also, obviously, we've been talking about the missiles, stones, spears and arrows being used, but clearly some of those, particularly the arrows, are poisoned. Now, probably not poisoned with poison that's going to provide, give instant fatality to humans, and in fact we see that doesn't really happen, but however it might be extremely nasty and it might have a concoction on it that makes you less able to fight, apart from the fact you've got an arrow in you. On that account, he ordered us, this is Magellan, he ordered us to retire slowly, in other words to retreat slowly and in order. But the men took to flight. The men panicked, went, whoa, and just started fleeing. Except 6 or 8 of us who remained with the captain. Well, 6 or 8 against 1,500. The natives shot at our legs. We'll come back to that in a second. For the latter were bare, and so many were the spears and stones that they hurled at us that we could offer no resistance. So the armour is really important here, okay? The fact that they've got helmets and corselets, whatever they should be, cuirasses, means that essentially they are completely invulnerable on most of their heads, maybe not their faces, but most of their heads and their torsos and probably their thighs, because at this point a corselet probably covers the tops of the thighs and groin as well. And it's really important to note that in this colonial warfare, it doesn't matter if an arrow is poisoned, if it can't stick in you. Metal armour that Europeans used was complete proof where it was, which parts of you it covered, against most native weapons. There are some exceptions when we look at South American and Mesoamerican warfare with slings and rocks. Maybe we'll look at that in a future episode with my friend Drakinifel, who has things to say about that. But by and large, typical spears, arrows, native swords, things like this will not go through metal armour. So therefore the metal armour. But it's clear that these native opponents of theirs, the Filipinos, realised they were exposed on the arms and legs and faces, as it turns out as well. Right, so the natives shot only at our legs, which were bare, okay? And so many of their spears and stones, were hurled at us that we could offer no resistance. The mortars in the boats could not aid us. Super interesting. How was that not mentioned before? So there are mortars specifically rather than just cannons, but they were too far away. Presumably we're talking about 600 or 800 yards, possibly even more, maybe 1,000 yards. And for whatever reason, they couldn't shoot that far at the natives on the beach. So really, that coral reef or rocks, whatever they were, was really critical to how this battle panned out. So yeah, the mortars couldn't help because they were too far away. So we continued to retire for more than a good crossbow flight from the shore. So half of whatever the full distance is. Always fighting up to our knees in the water. Now that's again important because the armour, I've heard people surmise that actually at this point their armour was a disadvantage because they couldn't retreat as quickly. Not so sure about that. I can run in armour and it's not like it's this huge distance they have to cover. It's, let's say it was 1,000 yards. That's actually not that far to run, especially when people are trying to kill you. And they're not wearing armour on their legs. Armour on their legs would have been impeding, but the fact that they're only wearing corselets, cuirasses and helmets, but nevertheless, possibly armour played a part. I would say armour was more beneficial because it prevented them from instant death, and it probably didn't slow them down that much. The natives continued to pursue us, and picking up the same spear 4 or 6 times, hurled it at us again and again. Super interesting point there that applies to all warfare, okay? If you are shooting arrows or throwing spears or javelins at an enemy and they are retreating and not picking up your missiles, they are just retreating, as you pursue them, you will eventually catch up with your arrow or your spear again and you can throw it or shoot it at them again. Really, really cool, really, really interesting detail. And to me, some people have doubted this account. To me, that really smacks of a detail which only someone who was there would have thought to mention. Recognising the captain, so many of them turned upon him that they knocked his helmet off his head twice. Again, super interesting detail that I think only someone who was close to him would have noticed. And the helmet obviously protects you against, sword blows, but it also protects you against missiles coming down. And most arrows have some degree of trajectory beyond about 30 yards. And so arrow with a helmet with a brim is going to protect against arrows. And the fact that it was knocked off twice and he put it back on, clearly very important. But he always stood firmly like a good knight, together with some others. Thus did we fight for more than 1 hour, refusing to retire further. An Indian hurled a bamboo spear into the captain's face. That tells us it's an open face helmet, which is no great surprise because that's what we would have expected for this time. But the latter immediately killed him with his lance. Again, interesting detail. So the captain isn't fighting primarily with a sword, he's fighting primarily with a spear of some kind. Now lance, lanza in Italian or lance in French, is a generic term for a spear-like pole weapon. So we don't specifically know what it was. It could have been a pike, but I think that's unlikely in this type of fighting. It's probably a half pike or a spear, or it could be potentially something like a partisan, which he left in the Indian's body. So he ran the opponent through. Indian, when they say Indian, they mean the Filipinos. He ran the spear of whatever type it was into the Indian's body and then presumably had to keep retreating and didn't have time to pull it out. Then, trying to lay his hand on his sword, he could only draw it out halfway because he'd been wounded in the arm with a bamboo spear. So either the spear is sticking in his arm or there's just a nasty wound which has impeded his mobility, or the spear is physically blocking his arm from moving up because it's pinning it somehow. We don't really know. But a very interesting detail, very precise. So he's trying to get his sword out to continue fighting retreat, but he can't because of something that this bamboo spear has done to him. When the natives saw that, they all hurled themselves upon him. One of them wounded him on the left leg with a large cutlass, which resembles a scimitar, only being larger. Now, we're going to stop there for a second. So I have seen the term that was used in Italian for this. It's not clear what weapon this is. Now, some people have surmised this was a campilan. Possibly it was a campilan. However, I don't think so. And that's because I think that for this to be translated into scimitar, it probably means a curved sword, but then we'd need to look at the original text and analyse that. So long story short, we don't really know what type of sword it was. I don't think it would yet be an early form of the Moro Kris, because I don't think they were really quite around at this date. Indeed, I don't think, although it's not impossible, that it's an early form of the Philippine barong. Okay, these are all traditional. Those are the two most famous Filipino swords. But there are other types of sword around in the Philippines at this time, with various types of blade, and usually simple hilt like this, sometimes with a cutting edge on the inwards curve, sometimes a cutting edge on the outwards curve. And indeed, there were trade blades and native-made blades as well, which did look somewhat like a scimitar, as some people would refer it today. So basically, we don't know what type of sword it was. It could have been a campilan, but it could have been almost anything else. All we can say is that it was a large sword. Now, in terms of Magellan himself, what would have he been armed with? Essentially, probably something like this side sword here. So probably a single-handed sword, being Portuguese and in Spanish service, almost certainly at this date with finger rings and probably a side ring, or perhaps even a pair of side rings. So it might have had a knuckle bow as well. It would have been one of these forms of a kind of early-ish side swords, or possibly it could have had a couple more bars on the hilt, could be a little bit more complex in 1521, could have a sidebar, for example, or potentially it could even just be a simple hilted, like an arming sword essentially, because even at this date, some of these side swords don't have any of these additional rings on. So we don't really know, but at this date it's not a rapier yet. It would be a sword, an arming sword, a side sword, rather than a later rapier. Right, so one of them wounded him on the left leg with a large cutlass, which resembles a scimitar, only being larger. So whatever it was big, could be a campilan. That caused the captain to fall face downwards. I'm not surprised, a large cut into the leg. Legs are not covered by armour in this particular case. When immediately they rushed upon him with iron and bamboo spears, and with their cutlasses, with their swords of various types. Don't think cutlasses here, that's just a European terminology, translation. They're referring to Filipino swords here. Until they killed out of mirror, our light, our comfort, and our true guide. Very poetic there. They killed him. They chopped him up. When they wounded him, he turned back many times to see whether we were all in the boats. So this is very much trying to paint Magellan as a hero, as trying to basically look out for his men and keep fighting for as long as possible to buy them their freedoms. To an extent, it seems like it succeeded. Now, when we talked about the numbers of combatants here, if there were 1,500 Filipino natives on that beach, it's very clear that there weren't that many people involved in this specific engagement. This sounds like at most a couple of dozen, or maybe a few dozen at most. Thereupon, beholding him dead, we, wounded, retreated as best we could to the boats, which were already pulling off. And it should be mentioned that Pigafetta, we know from his later writings, was wounded himself. The Christian king would have aided us, but that means the Christian Filipino converted king would have aided us. But the captain charged him before we landed not to leave his boat, but to stay to see how we fought. When the king learned that the captain was dead, he wept. Had it not been for that unfortunate captain, not a single one of us would have been saved to get back to the boats. For while he was fighting, the others did retire to the boats. So as mentioned, Pigafetta and the others who managed to make it back to the boats, they were all chopped about, wounded with arrows and spears and cut with swords. They were badly cut up and wounded, but they did manage to get back to the boats and to the ships, to the big ships. And they did manage to continue their voyage, minus Magellan. In fact, Magellan's body was buried there. There were various attempts to get his body back so it could receive a Christian burial and be buried back in Europe, but it wasn't given back. Lapulapu basically said no, he's staying here as an example, and Lapulapu became a Philippine national hero, but Magellan's body stayed in the Philippines. So I mentioned that some sources vary. Pigafetta's account is the most full, the most detailed, probably the most reliable, but there is a French author by the name of Thevet who was writing in 1584, published in Paris, and he says that Magellan was killed by an arrow, which is also partly borne out by Nicholas of Naples, who was a sailor on the Victoria, in his examination as a witness in support of Jaime Barbosa's claim to Magellan's estate in the year 1540. And he says, I was by his side and saw him killed by arrows and a lance wound which pierced his throat. So the problem is, in this kind of conflict, even in a modern crime scene, we've already seen Pigafetta said, yes, he was wounded by an arrow, yes, he was wounded by a lance, but he has him killed in basically chopped up at the end of the sword. We don't really know, but fundamentally, there are certain aspects of this fight which are very interesting from the point of view of studying both Renaissance European close combat, but also early colonial warfare. And it's very clear, as I've said many times in this video, it's very clear that armour, in fact firearms don't seem to have played much of a role in this one at all, but armour played a massive role. And the fact that he was wounded in the legs and wounded in the arm, and this is something we see through the various descriptions of this battle. It's very clear, and in Pigafetta's own account, that wounding in the arms, the face and the legs was super important because they were wearing armour on their torsos and heads. After this, the small fleet was taken over in command by Juan Sebastian Elcano, and he continued with the ships in a full circumnavigation back to Spain. And this was the first circumnavigation of the world, and he arrived back in Spain in 1522. So there we go. Magellan, although he didn't complete the circumnavigation, it was completed by Elcano, was certainly an incredibly important part of that first circumnavigation of the globe. And after a few hundred years of primarily Spanish colonial interference in the Philippines, Lapu-Lapu is now recognised as their first national hero. So thanks a lot for watching. I have been Matt Easton, and thanks again to Magellan TV for sponsoring this video. Remember to check out that link below, or the QR code that I put on screen earlier, because you can get a 30-day free trial of Magellan TV. So what's not to love about that? Thanks a lot to them for sponsoring this channel. Thanks a lot to you for sticking with me and watching, and I hope I see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks!